Pink Floyd were, or maybe still are, a British rock band. So I'm going to do a potted history of Pink Floyd. They're one of the most successful bands in history. Their appeal has been very big amongst the target demographic that's basically me. So if you're in a similar category, you might know quite a bit of this already. Um, so Pink Floyd started in 1965, which was a few years before the official start of progressive rock, which was in 1969. So they had to hang around for a few years waiting for that. But luckily, they had their own shining crazy diamond called Syd Barrett, who fitted in really well with the psychedelic stuff that was going on at the time. And they quickly realised that a recording studio was a kind of playground, so they had a lot of fun with experimental effects and processing and tape loops. Um, Dave Gilmour joined as a guitarist a little while later. Syd Barrett left. What left is not really as clear as that. He was kind of left out. And they left him behind. So whether Syd Barrett was actually crazy is something that's debated. He may have had mental health issues. He may have had drug issues. He certainly had some sort of issues. The remaining band members made a lot of mileage out of exploring mental health in some of their songs, particularly later on. And it's been widely assumed that this was about Syd. So Pink Floyd then got back to the serious business of reinventing themselves and waiting for the explosive success of Dark Side of the Moon. So they made several albums with music and experimental studio sounds, and they were generally fairly successful, having a particular relationship with film soundtracks and being somewhat progressive, but on their own terms, which I guess is the right thing to do when you talk about being progressive. They were not above having an organ now and then. They tended away from the mellotron in favour of guitar riffs and spacey synth chords. Fortunately, Dave Gilmour turned out to be a really good guitarist. So, 1973 and Dark Side of the Moon happened, and this was the start of the dominance of Roger Waters, who was their bassist. So this was now peak success time, with follow-up albums Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall. Somehow, where other prog rock acts faltered towards the end of the 70s and in the early 80s, Pink Floyd not only survived, but basically conquered the world at this point. Finally, with a sense of finality, they brought out an album called The Final Cut, which Roger Waters thought was the last ever Pink Floyd album, so he left. But it turned out he was wrong. So Dave Gilmour took the reins. And over the next 10 years, they only had 2 studio albums, but they sold so very well worldwide. And their other albums were still selling, and they did a lot of live shows, and they were generally hugely successful in this period as well. So after all that success, I think they were a bit tired out, so they took a break. The modern era has seen the reconciliation of Pink Floyd with Roger Waters. There's been several events and a rather curious final album called The Endless River. So now finally they might have finished. So Dave Gilmour seems to think so. Rick Wright died, so that only leaves Nick Mason, who's the drummer, if he wanted to carry on as Pink Floyd, but I think it's unlikely. Pink Floyd were, especially in the early days, influenced, or there was some influence backwards and forwards. Certainly they were influenced by contemporary classical that was going on, and krautrock may have influenced Pink Floyd, or Pink Floyd may have influenced krautrock. Who really knows? It may be that they were both just going from the same source of the contemporary classical and the minimalists and people like Terry Riley. But they brought these ideas and the interesting developments in music here to a much wider audience. So at this point, assuming that they've finished, their total studio album count is 14. Hi, my name's Dan. So this is the second studio album by Pink Floyd, and it was inevitable that there was going to be Pink Floyd on this list. and I will confess that Pink Floyd are one of my favourite bands ever. So I am by no means new to this. I probably first heard this album in, we're probably talking about 1980. So I had a friend at school, this was in my late teens, who made it his mission, a concerted effort on his part, to educate me about a whole load of music, which at the time we weren't using the label progressive rock, but it was basically progressive rock. And he introduced me to early Pink Floyd and to Van der Graaf Generator and to King Crimson and several other things from the late 60s, which made a huge impact on my listening and the stuff that I enjoyed. And this was one of the things that he introduced me to. So thanks if you're watching. I very much doubt he is. So that's my kind of listening history from here. So the history of how this fits in with Pink Floyd is that we've had Syd Barrett, who was their lead guy for one album, and we're into the second album, and Syd is deteriorating at this point. So his contributions are becoming less and more sporadic. In live shows, he's becoming unreliable. They've had to have some live shows cancelled. This album, the development of it is stretched over quite a period of time, it would seem. And so at some point they invited Dave Gilmour to join to effectively help plug the gaps that Syd was leaving. And then eventually got to the point where Dave Gilmour was always there, and on stage Syd would kind of wander about and then occasionally join in, until eventually they decided on the way to one gig not to bother picking him up. And that was kind of the end of Syd Barrett being in Pink Floyd, but I don't think it was ever really an official thing. But that meant that with the development of the album, that Dave Gilmour came in. There's still some Syd Barrett stuff. There's only one track that features all five of them. They had been used to Syd writing all the songs, so they started to try and contribute songs of their own, and they followed some of the same kind of basic ideas that Syd had introduced. So there's two basic modes here for the songs. So one is a kind of childlike naivety, which is very popular kind of idea for the hippie movement. This idea of singing songs about things that weren't particularly profound, but finding a sort of innocence within that. So there are a few songs that are definitely like that. Interestingly, there is one that's Corporal Clegg, which has that kind of feel to it, but actually when you listen to the words is less innocent, because it's about the effects of war on somebody. And then the other mode that they've got is the development of space rock soundscapes. So A Saucerful of Secrets, the title track, is the longest track here, and is very much built on this idea of soundscapes rather than as a song. The guy who was producing the album at this point was quite resistant to this. He was trying to get them to do 3.5-minute songs that would be played on the radio, and they were certainly developing in this area. And it's stuff that's been influenced by or co-influenced with krautrock around the same sort of time, but also contemporary classical was doing these sorts of things. And the sort of studio jiggery-pokery and playing around was very much kind of becoming a thing at this point. Particularly, Pink Floyd seemed to enjoy using tape loops, and there's quite a bit of that going on this album. So Jugland Blues is the only Syd Barrett written song. He's involved in playing on some of the others. There's highlights. There's quite a nice kazoo in Corporal Clegg. And Corporal Clegg kind of feels a bit Beatles-like in terms of it's a story song. Overall, it's a good listen. I mean, I enjoy it. I have enjoyed it for years. I prefer, I think, the space rock stuff, the experimental long tracks. I quite still like the Naïve tracks on here. I don't think these are the best Naïve tracks from Pink Floyd, but I try not to compare with other albums too much when I'm doing these reviews. Contextually, it kind of shows the direction that they were going in. They were going to keep both these ideas for quite a few albums from here, but they were definitely going to develop the long evolving soundscape type idea. But they were quite consistently for a few years still throwing in the shorter tracks and the songs. As an album, it's in some ways it's a strange mixture and it's a bit of a mess, really, I would say. It feels not planned as an album experience. I think that's probably my biggest criticism of it. For me, it's got a whole load of nostalgic resonance to it, so obviously I love it for that. It's by no means my favourite Pink Floyd album, but there are some good tracks on here, and I have enjoyed listening to it. You may well have your own opinion on this album. You may well disagree with me. I'd love to hear from you. So let me know in the comments below, please. That's it from me for now.